Hello, this section is entitled Deploying in an Application, Updating Scaling Configuration, Versions, and Traffic Splitting. But this is the Cloud Functions version of this. So Cloud Functions essentially is another compute option that Google has. And it's basically called a scalable function as a service. So in this case, instead of writing a whole application, you're just basically deploying a single function, which is like, just whatever language you're using, it's basically just a single function. It does that function and then it's done. The pricing is a little bit different model. It's more based on invocations than maybe, other examples we've seen. It's basically about CPU, per hour. I mean, how much CPU you're using. This is more about invocations, and there is a fee related to the CPU, but it's more oriented towards how many times you invoke this function, rather than how long your instance stayed up. So it's a different model. Now another thing that's different about this is that, like, if you're trying to expose a web endpoint, right? In all the previous examples, we essentially wrote an application that handled HTTP requests. In this case, you actually have to write just a function that fits into a broader framework, and it's per language. So like for Node, you have to basically write an express function. So you're really locked into a particular sort of way of coding, and again, every function can only respond to one endpoint too. So it's kind of very different programming style than all the other examples. Now I think maybe just best to just look at it by example. So we're going to do everything on the console. You can do everything from the CLI too if you wanted to, but you can visualize more here. So there's Cloud Functions, and I think I've already activated it because I did this earlier. But first time you come in here, it'll activate this API. You hit the Create Function button, right? And this first pass will just keep it simple, and then we'll look at some more options later. You basically give it a name. You pick a region, so it is a regional resource, right? You specify how you're going to trigger this. Now there are other kind of triggers, and we'll talk about some of these later, right? But in this case, we want this HTTP to come in and trigger it. They're going to give you a URL here. In fact, I'm going to copy that just so I have it for later, right? And then we don't want to worry about authentication, so we're going to make it a public API. And we just hit save, right? And then we hit next. And then here we go into a code editor. And so there's different languages, right? So I'll just use Node 14 since that's what we used earlier, right? And you notice that the code here looks a little different than our other code. It's basically a singular, it's basically this is a JavaScript module, and it's exporting a function called hello world, and it already assumes that you're using request under the hood, because you can see that these request and response objects, those are express objects, and basically you're done. And again, you're not doing any routing here. You can only basically respond to a single request, and you can't differentiate between different endpoints and stuff like that. So that's pretty much all there is to it. I believe, I haven't gone through the exercise, but if you wanted to add dependencies, you can actually add dependencies in your package JSON, right? So you can do dependencies. But again, it feels very different than other applications, right? Hit deploy, and I'm going to pause the video because it takes about a minute or so to create the function. Okay, we're back. Took about a minute or so. And here's our function. First of all, I copied that URL. So if I just paste that URL, looks like it's formats like region, project name, cloudfunctions.net, and then the name of the function, and there's my hello world, right? And that's about it. Now let's look at logging real quick. So you can see if you click on the function, they'll give you lots of details. Get rid of this. Get you details about your function, right? So there's monitoring, there's logs. I don't think we did any logging per se in ours, but you can see if I was to do console logs here, I would see them here. Right? What else are we going to talk about? Logs. Oh, scaling. Okay, so the last thing is about scaling. So what we can do is we can edit our function. So let me see if I can get this right. Go back to my function. Oh, I didn't talk about versions. So if I want to make a new version of this, I only have one version. If I want to make a new version, we'll just do that real quick. Hit edit. Next. Hello World 2. V2. Deploy. And I'm going to pause the video for a second. Then we'll come back. Okay, we're back. So now the function, I think I've still got this copied. If I paste, it must be caching. There it is, yeah. So hello version 2, so there's the change, right? See, the last thing we want to talk about is scaling, right? So one thing that's interesting about cloud functions is they behave sort of fundamentally different than the other compute examples we've done, in a sense that every time there's another invocation, if there's not an idle instance lying around, it creates a new instance. So one instance of a cloud function cannot handle more than one request. And so what happens then is say you had 1,000 simultaneous requests, you're going to have 1,000 instances of the function running at that moment. So that's essentially how it scales. It just automatically scales by creating new, basically, instances. And the only real control you have is setting. Let's see, I'll show you where it's at. The only really configurable setting around scaling is under runtime. You can set right here, how many maximum instances you have. So by default, there is an infinite, so you can, it'll create as many instances as it needs to support the load. But then you can put an upper limit if you want to control costs. Maybe you have a database that's backing this that can't handle too many simultaneous calls. This is basically the number of instances. The one thing it does do under the hood for handling kind of like slow startups, right? In other examples, we usually set a minimum number of instances that would be running all the time. Behind the scenes, that's how we handled it, like in Cloud Run and whatnot. Here, the way we handle like being able to start quickly is that Cloud Functions automatically kind of keeps them idle. It doesn't like throw away instances right away. So it keeps a certain number of idle instances lying around if you have a lot of traffic. And that way you don't have to like spin up all the libraries and stuff every time a function kind of comes up. So it kind of handles the minimum for you kind of automatically. So the only thing you really have to fuss around with was the maximum. Another thing is, the question is, can you do things like route splitting, right? That was something we looked at in other examples. And the answer is it does not appear to be the case. I Googled it. And also, when you deploy new code, you don't get a list of, it's funny, this is even a pull down, but there's only one version that's ever active at a time. And so it's not like you can see the different revisions like we saw with Cloud Run or versions with App Engine, right? There's just basically the current version. It does increment the number, but you can't see the other versions, which means there's no option to like split traffic between things. So it's kind of, there's just the function, and then you update it, then you get the next version of the function. And I believe that is all the main topics. So thank you.